It was 11:47 at night, full moon, the kind of sky that looks like it's holding its breath, and I was sitting in my patio chair with nachos in one hand and binoculars in the other, watching my neighbor commit what I can only describe as suburban water piracy. I whispered to myself, to nobody in particular, to the universe and whatever sense of justice it still had left. This woman is about to learn what happens when you mess with someone who grew up with three brothers, a full toolkit, and a petty streak longer than Route 66. This is the story of how I fought an HOA tyrant with blue dye, industrial glitter, gelatinous beet juice, and the power of a neighborhood that was absolutely done being pushed around, and how she lost spectacularly, starting with her own flowers. To understand Karen, you have to understand the kind of person who gets a license plate that literally reads, "Rule as one." Not as a joke, not with any self-awareness, as a genuine statement of personal philosophy.
Karen was not just the HOA president of Elmwood Estates. She was the self-appointed landscaping overlord, the aesthetic guardian, the one-woman compliance department who had turned suburban governance into something between a minor dictatorship and a full-time performance piece. She measured grass height with an actual ruler. She once issued a $50 fine because someone's Halloween pumpkin remained on their porch into the first week of November, lingering gourd in violation of seasonal decoration standards. She rang my doorbell at 6:12 in the morning to inform me that my garbage can had been visible from the street. Not for hours. Visible from the street. She sent formal written warnings about wind chimes that didn't match house paint colors. She ran monthly HOA newsletters with color-coded compliance charts. She had, over the years of her reign, turned the simple act of having a yard into an ongoing legal negotiation with a woman who believed deeply that the rules existed to serve her, and more importantly, to control everyone else. The rules, as it turned out, were not something Karen personally felt obligated to follow. The whole community was under water restrictions. The city had issued 3 warnings about drought conditions, and we've been told to limit watering to twice a week, early morning hours only. The rest of the neighborhood complied. My lawn went from suburban green to crunchy beige within days. My neighbor across the street had grass that looked like rejected salad toppings. The couple down the block gave up on their flower beds entirely and covered them with decorative gravel. Karen's garden, meanwhile, was lush, vibrant, and impeccably hydrated. Her hydrangeas glowed like they'd been receiving private blessings from some plant deity. Her roses were full and heavy-headed. Her entire yard looked like it was in a completely different climate from the rest of ours, which was, I would come to discover, technically accurate, because she had arranged her own private water supply. Mine. I didn't notice the bill at first. Summer rates always creep up, and I didn't think much of a slightly higher number at the end of July. But then I got a late notice claiming I owed triple my usual amount, and that number was too large to explain away. I walked the property line looking for a leak. Nothing. I checked the irrigation timer. Fine. I called the water company. They told me, with complete cheerful confidence, that there was no billing error. The consumption was correct. That was just how much water had gone through my line. That was when I looked at the hose. It didn't coil quite the way I'd left it. I followed it along the side of the house, and there, neatly installed, carefully concealed, was a splitter. A hose splitter. One end connected to my spigot as usual. The other end ran through a gap in the hedge into Karen's backyard, where it connected to what I quickly realized was a hidden drip irrigation system running the entire length of her garden. Karen, the woman who had cited me for wind chimes, who had fined someone for a lingering pumpkin, who ran the neighborhood's compliance infrastructure with the dedication of a career regulator, had literally tapped into my water line and had been running her garden on my bill for weeks. I stood there looking at the splitter for a long time. Not from rage exactly, from something quieter. The specific, clarifying anger of someone who has just understood something completely. I could have gone straight to the HOA board. I could have emailed Karen directly.
I could have knocked on her door with the splitter in hand and had a perfectly reasonable adult conversation about theft and hypocrisy and basic decency. But here's the thing about going to an HOA board when the HOA president is the person you're complaining about. It goes nowhere. The system belongs to her. The process belongs to her. The minutes of any meeting get written by her or reviewed by her, and her sense of righteousness is so total and so deeply held that she would find a way to make my legitimate water bill complaint into a violation of some rule I'd technically broken by noticing it. So instead, I did what any reasonable person would do in this situation. I bought a lawn chair, a bag of chips, and a GoPro, which I taped to a tiki torch for optimal sightline coverage, and I waited. Just like a raccoon who has memorized your trash day, Karen struck at 11:47 p.m. She materialized out of the darkness wearing matching garden gloves and a visor, moving with complete confidence toward the hose along my fence line.
She dragged a section through the hedge, connected it to her drip system under a garden gnome. She had hidden it under a garden gnome, which I respect on a technical level, and set the whole thing running without a single glance around to check whether anyone was watching. The smug HOA presidential confidence radiated off her like expensive sunscreen. She had done this so many times that it had become entirely routine. I checked the timestamp, 11:47. She probably had it scheduled. I did not sleep that night, but not from rage, from inspiration. The next morning, I drove to a hardware store 2 towns over, the kind where nobody asks why you're buying industrial dye in bulk or wants to make small talk about your project. I picked up the following: industrial blue clothing dye, 3 bottles of dish soap, garden-grade check valves, and a glitter-infused car wash additive that I had absolutely no legitimate use for, but that felt essential to the vision I was developing. The concept was simple.
If Karen wanted to tap into my water line, she was going to get everything I put in it. Literally. I set up a pressure-safe garden sprayer, created my mixture with the careful attention of a man who has a very specific creative goal in mind, and backfed it into the stolen hose line that night while the neighborhood slept. I left a small sign near the hose that said, "Do not touch." Decorative, just in case anyone got curious. The next morning, I was not outside when it happened. I heard it. A shriek. High-pitched, operatic, the unmistakable sound of someone whose garden expectations have just been violently revised, that echoed across 3 fence lines and hit my ears from inside my kitchen like the opening note of the most satisfying song I had ever heard. I ran to the window. Karen stood in her garden holding up a white rose that now looked like it had been processed through a Smurf's artisan coffee operation.
Her flower bed was a landscape of bright blue petals, soap foam, and a glittery shimmer that caught the morning sunlight like the aftermath of a very unholy celebration. Her face was cycling through rage, disbelief, and horror in a rapid sequence that I would have paid money to watch again. I took a sip of coffee. I waved through the window. She did not wave back. Later that afternoon, she arrived at my front door, dragging the hose like a wounded animal, holding up a blue-stained gardening glove. "What did you do?" she demanded. "My flowers! My soil smells like vinegar and dawn." I tilted my head with genuine-looking confusion. "That's odd. My hose has been acting funny too. Maybe someone's been messing with it." She opened her mouth, stopped, because she knew. She knew that I knew. And more importantly, she could see from my expression that I was not scared of her. "I'm filing a complaint," she hissed. "With who?" I asked with a smile. "You?" Her eye twitched. "This isn't over." She stormed off, trailing a faint sparkle in her wake. She was right that it wasn't over. She had no idea how right she was. Karen went quiet for 2 days. Not a scowl, not a passive-aggressive sticky note disguised as a community reminder, not even one of her signature sighs directed at my side of the fence. Her yard, however, told the full story. The once pristine rows of white roses looked like they'd been tie-dyed by someone working through strong feelings. Foam still clung to certain petals like soap suds,
that had simply decided to stay. Her prized petunias had taken on a frothy seafoam tint. Her hydrangeas, once a delicate pale lavender, were now electric blue with a light scatter of glitter catching the sun from every angle. It was beautiful. Objectively, genuinely, horrifically beautiful. I had fully expected immediate retaliation, a formal fine, a neighborhood-wide email full of vague moral outrage, a complaint so creative it required its own legal citation. Instead, I got silence. The specific, ominous silence of a person who is no longer screaming because they have started planning. The kind of quiet that makes you glance over your shoulder while watering your own lawn, even if you haven't technically done anything wrong recently. Karen was plotting. So was I, but with significantly more enthusiasm. What Karen didn't know was that the first batch, the blue, foamy, glittery introduction, had been the beta test. I'd gone light on the vinegar, skipped the gelatin entirely, left out most of the glitter because I wanted room to escalate if escalation became necessary. And now, with clear confirmation that she was still running her stolen irrigation setup and had apparently decided that counterattack rather than negotiation was her preferred strategy, it was time to go full gourmet. The new mixture was a masterpiece of petty engineering. Vinegar and soap as the base, a classic, proven foundation. Cornstarch for viscosity, and what I privately called the gunk factor. Beet juice for a reddish-brown that I thought of as the bleeding garden effect. A more aggressive industrial blue dye meant for heavy denim fabric. And glitter. Cosmetic-grade, biodegradable, but effective enough that anything it touched would sparkle indefinitely and without apology. I also added, as the secret weapon, a fizzy bath bomb core dropped into the line before sealing it. Not for any chemical reason, purely for theatrical effect. I fed it all into the system at 2 in the morning and went to bed feeling unreasonably satisfied with my life choices. The next morning I was at my living room window before sunrise like a child on December 25th. Karen emerged into her garden in full gear, hose in hand, the unshakable confidence of someone who believes they are winning. She crossed to the spigot, twisted it, and held the hose over her flower beds. A faint fizzing sound began. Then came the shriek. This one was different. Not just her flowers this time. The mixture sprayed in multiple directions simultaneously, coating her gloves, her shoes, and somehow her cat, which shot across the yard, leaving a trail of sparkly blue paw prints behind it. Her flowers began frothing at the base like something was performing an ancient ritual in the soil. The smell arrived next. Sweet, tropical, deeply wrong in the context of an outdoor garden at 7 in the morning. Karen gagged, kicked over a planter, tripped over a decorative stone rabbit, let out a guttural, extended sound that carried across the entire block. A neighbor across the street peeked out from behind a curtain, took one look at the blue carnage, and immediately ducked back inside. From down the block, I could see someone else had their phone out, filming. By sunset, Karen had called an emergency HOA board meeting, citing deliberate horticultural sabotage. The irony was thick enough to be structural. I wasn't invited to the emergency meeting, which turned out not to matter because I had an inside source. Phil, a soft-spoken retired man who had been on the HOA board since before Karen took over, who had watched years of her behavior with the weary patience of someone who knows a situation is unsustainable but can't quite figure out how to end it, had started sliding quietly into accidental whistleblower territory. He'd seen the hose setup. He'd heard Karen at a wine-soaked neighborhood mixer casually mention borrowing water from nearby properties, as though that was a normal sentence for a person to say out loud. And her latest meltdown apparently had pushed him past the limit of what he was willing to keep pretending not to notice. That night, he left an anonymous envelope on my doorstep. Inside were printed minutes from previous HOA meetings, documentation of decisions made without proper resident notification, and a handwritten note that read, "We're sick of her too. Keep going." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my celebratory gummy worms. This had officially become a movement. 2 days later, Karen made what I would come to think of as her most audacious move. She announced a neighborhood garden showcase, a public event open to all residents during which she would display her impeccable garden and demonstrate her commitment to community beautification. Her yard, still clearly recovering from its recent blue transformation, had been hastily replanted in visible sections and covered in decorative burlap in others, attempting to hide the stained soil underneath. She had also apparently visited a nursery and brought in potted plants that she then positioned around the yard, as though they were long-established residents of her garden, rather than very recent commercial acquisitions. I attended with polite enthusiasm and a GoPro hidden inside a decorative lawn gnome that I carried with me. She gave the tour with the confidence of someone who genuinely believes she is the most credible person in every room. When she reached the section she had taken to calling her irrigation station, which was, to be absolutely clear, the section of yard connected to my stolen water line, she bragged about her efficient use of community resources and her thoughtful approach to sustainable watering practices. The gnome recorded every word. I nodded along, complimented her water-smart flowers, and left without saying anything notable. That night, I uploaded the full video anonymously to our neighborhood Facebook group, time-stamped and annotated, with the stolen splitter setup circled in red. Then I cross-posted it to the relevant subreddit for good measure. Within hours, it had spread beyond the neighborhood. Comments poured in. People recognized her voice, her yard, her particular brand of self-satisfied narration. The video traveled. Someone from a local news station reached out to the HOA for comment. Karen's response was an all-caps email to the neighborhood group accusing online trolls of spreading dangerous misinformation, which functioned primarily to make even more people aware that there was a video worth finding. The tide in Elmwood Estates was turning, visibly, rapidly, and with significant community participation. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before were appearing at the fence to express solidarity. Several confessed they had noticed mysteriously elevated water bills of their own in recent months. Karen, it turned out, had not limited her unofficial water acquisition program to my spigot. Then came the vines. When direct confrontation failed and public embarrassment had not produced surrender, Karen switched strategies. She planted a row of climbing vines along the fence line, dense, fast-growing, positioned deliberately to creep through the fence slats into my yard. By the end of the first week, my fence had a full wall of green climbing up its exterior. My solar lights were wrapped. My rosemary bush was being slowly strangled. The vines were inching toward my patio grow with the patient determination of something that doesn't have a concept of property lines. I recognized the plant immediately. Kudzu, the botanical equivalent of a zombie outbreak. Once established, it devours everything in reach, multiplies aggressively, and genuinely does not care about human boundary agreements. Karen had planted it without HOA approval, because seeking approval would have required acknowledging that she was subject to the same rules as everyone else, which had never been part of her worldview. I emailed the HOA with photographs, timestamps, and a PDF titled "The Vine Invasion, a Cautionary Tale." The response came back in 15 minutes. The vines were deemed aesthetic and non-threatening, and, the board's new favorite phrase, not visible from the street. If a problem couldn't be seen from a passing car, it apparently didn't exist. That evening, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside, a portable moisture meter, a USB stick, a bag of organic glitter, and a sticky note that read, "Keep pushing, she's cracking. P." Phil, continuing his remarkable side career as an inside operative, was still feeding me intelligence, and he had just sent me something genuinely useful on the USB drive. Draft. Text of a proposed horticultural ethics clause Karen was trying to push through the board, which read like a passive-aggressive manifesto with HOA letterhead. It was time to escalate again. But this time, not with dye. I hired a professional landscape inspector, not to evaluate Karen's flowers, to measure the fence line. It turned out that the section of property she had planted her invasive vine row on overlapped a stretch of protected greenbelt bufferland maintained by the city. Those vines weren't just ugly and aggressive, they were illegal. The inspector wrote up a detailed report with photographs, precise measurements, and city code violations. He filed it with the appropriate municipal department. When the official city citation letter arrived at Karen's door, bright yellow envelope, city seal, clear language about invasive species encroachment on protected land, she screamed loudly enough that a neighbor's dog began howling 2 houses away. She stormed to the HOA office, which was her converted garage, and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the decorative fake ivy above the frame. Then she called an emergency board meeting, the 4th one in recent weeks. Nobody came. Phil told me later she'd sat alone in a folding chair, surrounded by her laminated complaint folders and a plate of untouched cucumber sandwiches, waiting for a meeting that never assembled. It was over. She just hadn't accepted it yet. The vote required a majority. Phil had been quietly building toward it for weeks, but there were 2 holdouts on the board. Neighbors who either feared Karen's documented history of retaliation or simply didn't want to be involved in the conflict. I needed something that would make their abstention impossible. Something undeniable. So I called my cousin Joey, who worked at a local news station doing camera work and editing for community segments, and who owed me a significant academic debt from a high school math course. I cashed it in. I told him everything: the water theft, the blue dye, the glitter, the splitter under the gnome, the vine invasion, the city violation, the neighborhood Facebook page erupting into memes, the HOA president who enforced wind chime color codes while stealing her neighbor's water. He said, "You had me at Blue Flowers." The weekend after our conversation, a news van rolled into Elmwood Estates for what they billed as a local community piece about rising water bills and neighborhood tensions over landscaping enforcement. They interviewed me on my front lawn, standing next to my spigot, now fitted with a heavy-duty lock and a camera mounted directly at it. I was polite, precise, and thorough. I mentioned the spike in my water bill, the unauthorized splitter, the midnight watering sessions I had documented on camera, the hose running through the hedge. I didn't say Karen's name, I didn't need to. Then the crew walked to Karen's house. To her credit, she came out with lemon bars. She smiled. She welcomed the crew like someone who has not spent the last month running a water theft operation and filing fabricated complaints against her neighbor. She tried to steer the interview toward her roses and her commitment to community values. Then the reporter asked about the city violation. Karen's smile cracked, visibly on camera. She fumbled, blamed jealous neighbors and anonymous vandals, and stormed off mid-interview when the reporter asked whether she had any footage to support her version of events. The segment was 3 minutes long. It aired that night. It lit the neighborhood up like a string of fireworks. People who had never engaged with HOA politics suddenly had detailed opinions. The fence sitters made decisions. Even the man 3 houses down who only emerged to collect mail in a bathrobe had thoughts. Karen had finally done the one thing a person in her position cannot survive doing. She had embarrassed herself in public. The day of the vote, the meeting room was packed. Residents who normally wouldn't touch an HOA meeting with a 10-foot rake brought lawn chairs. One woman brought a pan of homemade cookies. I brought the blue-stained hose, coiled neatly in a clear plastic storage bin, labeled in marker, Exhibit A. Karen arrived looking like she was prepared for war. Perfect posture, sharp blazer, arms full of laminated rule books and manila folders that she arranged on the table in front of her like legal weapons. But the energy in the room was different from every previous meeting. Nobody was deferential. Nobody was looking at their hands to avoid eye contact. The room had made up its mind before anyone called it to order. Phil sat in the center chair with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for exactly this for a very long time. He opened the floor for discussion. Karen launched into a speech. It was impassioned, furious, and full of enough contradictions that it could have served as the monologue for a sitcom villain. She accused board members of betrayal. She described herself as a pillar of order in a collapsing society. She actually said the words, "I am the HOA," slowly, deliberately, like she expected them to land with the weight of a constitutional amendment. When she finished, the room was quiet enough that you could hear someone unwrap a mint. Phil looked down the length of the table. "I'm calling for the vote. 8 in favor of removal, 1 abstention. 0 support for Karen." She looked around the room like a person who has just discovered that the ground they've been standing on was never as solid as they believed. She demanded to know who voted against her. She accused Phil of staging a coup. She called me a sociopathic gardener, a title I did not hate, and then stood, gathered her laminated rulebook, and walked out while muttering about lawyers and the formation of a rival neighborhood association. As she passed me near the door, she stopped. Her eyes went to the blue hose coiled in the bin. For a moment she stared at it like she was considering taking it back, as though it had always belonged to her. Then she shook her head and kept walking. The room didn't erupt. It did something better. It let out a long, collective exhale, the specific sound of a group of people who have been holding tension for a very long time and are only now releasing it. Phil was named interim president before the meeting ended. First order of business: repealing Karen's most absurd regulations, including the wind chime color mandate and the garbage can timing ordinance. Second order: installing lockable spigots on all exterior water connections across the neighborhood. Third order: planning a block party called Water Wars, the ceasefire, which turned out to be the most well-attended neighborhood social event in Elmwood history. I brought drinks. Karen's house went quiet after that. The vines were professionally removed at her expense, per the city citation requirements. The flowers faded without their secret water supply. A for sale sign went up within a few weeks. The listing described the property as a charming home with character and unique garden features, which was technically accurate in a way that required significant creative interpretation. There was one final act. A few weeks after the vote, I discovered a faint bluish puddle working its way along the base of my side fence into the yard. I leaned down. Blue dye, a vinegary smell, a faint trace of glitter. My own mixture, or a diluted version of it, poured back into my garden through the broken old hose Karen had once used for her water theft scheme. A final act of spite, dumping my own garden cocktail into my flower beds as a parting shot. The problem was the slope. Our yards ran downhill from Karen's property toward the fence. When the mixture flowed out, gravity did what gravity does. It ran back. By noon, Karen's front yard was stained, foamy, and glittering in the sun. The HOA, under new management, with updated codes that specifically addressed intentional chemical spreading, issued her a formal citation. It came with a significant fine. She was seen pacing her lawns, screaming into her phone. The for sale sign tilted slightly in what I chose to interpret as a defeated lean. The new owners were a young couple with rescue dogs who showed up on moving day full of chaotic, warm energy and immediately started asking about their koi pond plans. When I pointed out the old hose scars in the soil and warned them the ground had a colorful history, they grinned and said it sounded fun. That was the moment I knew, definitively, that the war was over. New people, clean energy, a koi pond where Karen's secret irrigation network used to run. Everything exactly as it should be. I kept the camera, of course. You don't survive a Karen and then stop documenting things. But my mornings changed. No more midnight stakeouts. No more mixing concoctions at 2 in the morning with the focused intensity of a man who has a very specific creative goal. No more vibrant blue hoses and screaming neighbors and neighborhood Facebook pages evolving in real time into weapons. Just mornings and coffee and a legitimately watered garden doing exactly what gardens are supposed to do. Here's what I actually think when I think about all of this. Not the glitter, though the glitter was inspired, and not the blue roses, and not even the moment Karen's own final attempt at revenge literally flowed back into her own yard because gravity is consistent and principled in a way that certain HOA presidents are not. What I think about is the specific kind of confidence that enables someone to steal their neighbor's water while enforcing wind chime regulations, and how completely and totally it depends on nobody looking closely enough to notice the contradiction. Karen's power was real for as long as people chose not to document, not to talk to each other, not to show up for meetings where decisions were made. The moment the neighborhood started actually paying attention, it evaporated. The hoses are locked. The rules are reasonable. Phil sends one monthly email that contains actual information rather than a color-coded compliance manifesto. People wave at each other and mean it. And somewhere in a house she no longer owns, Karen probably still thinks she was the reasonable one in all of this. That's fine. She can have that story. The rest of us have the block party photos, Phil's commemorative certificate for exceptional civic mischief in defense of personal plumbing, and the memory of a garden turned electric blue on a summer morning by the specific consequence of stealing water from the wrong neighbor. It was, from start to finish, worth every ounce of glitter. If this story made you laugh until you had to put your drink down, or if you have a Karen story of your own that needs to be told, drop it in the comments. I read them. I appreciate every one. Subscribe if you want more, because there are more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next one.